Welcome to this afternoon session of a Fireside Chat with at least the former FDA. And we have the privilege of having Dr. Dan Schultz here, and I want to do a brief introduction of him. Again, I'm Mark Duvall from Duvall & Associates, a regulatory law firm here in the Twin Cities. I've known Dan for a long time. I'm going to make some personal comments in a minute, but let me first give you a little bit. You have most of his bio, but I'll highlight just a few things. He joined Greenleaf Health following a distinguished 35-year career devoted to supporting and advancing Americans' public health. As a physician, a teacher at the FDA and the Public Health Service. We, frankly, all know him as the center director from 2004 to 2009. So I recently worked with a client that went on Dr. Shuren's first appeal on a PMA, on a not approvable decision, and we brought in Dan to critique our presentation. It was extraordinarily helpful. And we got some very, very good guidance. And the things we're about to talk about are some of the things we asked him in preparation for that meeting. And let me just start kind of on a macro basis, Dan. So now that you're out of the agency, you can sort of look back and tell us some of the things that you're proud of, that you felt that you accomplished, and while you were there.
My predecessor, David Feigl, sort of coined the phrase, when it at least as applied to medical devices, of total product life cycle. And what he did was he put, there were signs all over CDRH, and there were these pinwheels. I don't know if you remember the pinwheels that we used to use in all of our talks, showing the life cycle of medical products and the life cycle and the regulatory life cycle and how they're supposed to line up. And the truth of the matter is, I think David was really, he's a very smart guy, obviously, and sort of a visionary. But most of the people in the center really had no clue what those pinwheels were all about. I mean, they'd go around and they'd look at the pinwheels on the wall and they'd kind of, get these looks. So when I became center director, I had a very simple goal. My goal was not to innovate or to change the world. My goal was to make those pinwheels real and to try to create a center where all the different pieces sort of fit together, not necessarily raising the bar, lowering the bar, but just trying to create the most efficient regulatory system possible for medical devices. And one of the things that I felt fairly strongly about and continue to feel strongly about is that in order to do that, we, the FDA, the device community, need to take advantage of all the different tools. Those tools being pre-market review, which is one aspect of it, post-market surveillance, compliance activities, science-based activities, research-based activities. All those things need to fit together in a single system. And I guess, so to answer your question, if there was anything that I felt like that was sort of my mission at the agency as center director, it was to try to make that happen.
Okay. Is there anything that you felt you left incomplete or undone?
Yeah, but we would need a whole afternoon for that list.
Give us a few of the highlights.
Well, I think that we were able to put the matrix together, which was, again, an attempt to sort of institutionalize this idea of people working together. And I think that was starting to make this real for people. But frankly, I think that there's still a ways to go. I think there still tends to be a fairly siloed approach, both within CDRH as well as the rest of the agency in terms of how they look at things. In fact, I still hear comments like, we should separate the pre-market from the post-market because, we don't want the post-market people who are the safety people tainted by the pre-market people who actually meet with industry. And I hear that, and I'm sort of look at these people like, what are you talking about? I mean, because I grew up with the pre-market folks, and I know that, yes, they're tough, and yes, they do meet and they try to reach solutions, but they're just as interested in safety as anybody, but with an understanding that there is, in fact, always going to be some risk benefit and always going to be some trade-offs that you have to make in terms of getting technologies to market, but also addressing whatever safety issues there are. So again, I think, to me, it doesn't make sense to say, separate them. In fact, what I think we need to do is bring them closer together so that the people that deal with safety can provide information to the reviewers so that they can learn from experiences with previous iterations of devices, and vice versa. The post-market people need to listen to the pre-market people and try to understand why they thought it was appropriate to approve a certain product at a certain time because of the data that was available to them. So anyway.
Where do you think, from a CDRH standpoint, where do you think broadly their priorities are and where you think they're headed?
Well, I think, clearly they came in with a certain set of expectations in terms of where they needed to go, and I think that, there obviously are a number of sort of broad initiatives that are going on now that, frankly, I think, the jury's still out in terms of where they'll go and exactly where they'll end up. I hope that, there is, I hope there won't be a tendency to just want to wipe the slate clean and sort of start all over again, because frankly, having been at the agency for 15 years, I think there were probably a few people with some degree of intelligence and understanding before this current group came in, and there'll be some people with some intelligence and understanding after they leave. And I always felt that way, that I was sort of part of an evolution as opposed to, creating something brand new. And I think, assuming that, that they spend the time to really learn from what's happened in the past and then try to improve on it, hopefully things will go in the right direction.
Okay. A lot of dialogue about 510K program and PMA approval requirements. Where do you think the center is headed today on both of those programs? And just give us some of your observations from the other side of the fence.
Yeah. Well, I think, number one, I think the thing that I hear and that I see is, that there's a sense of uncertainty in terms of where things are headed. And, that's that's always difficult, and I think this audience probably recognizes that better than most. Uncertainty does not breed, a sense of trying to move things forward. It sort of breeds, sort of stopping and waiting and seeing, which is a tough place to be when you're talking about technology and innovation. So I think that's one thing. In terms of where it all ends up, I think there's little doubt that for some 510K products, there will be the bar will be raised, and I guess, again, to me the question, I don't disagree with that, quite frankly. And I used to, when I used to go out and talk, I get criticisms about, well, we had this device 10 years ago, and you guys only asked for, 3 bench tests and 2 rats, and now you're asking for all this stuff in a clinical trial and this, and I'd look at them and I say, well, yeah, but the device that you brought in 10 years ago was a mechanical device made out of stainless steel. And the device that you have now that essentially does the same thing, has 50 computer chips and 50 different materials, and works in conjunction with 3D imaging. So yeah, it's the same device, and it's the same. It's under the same product code, and it has been deemed substantially equivalent to something that was substantially equivalent, that was substantially equivalent, that was substantially equivalent, which is the way the process works, and I think most of the time works successfully in terms of various iterations of devices. But to sit here and expect that the agency, that you're creating these new technologies, and that the agency is just going to ask you for the same data that it asked you for that old device 10 or 20 years ago, is just ridiculous. I mean, you wouldn't do that kind of testing on your own device. Why would you expect the agency to ask for that kind of testing? So I believe that the greatness of the of the medical device industry is its ability to iterate and to improve. And I think there needs to be an expectation that the agency needs to continue to change and to improve its processes as well in order to be able to deal with the advancing technology. The question is how, and the question is how well those changes are communicated, how quickly they're done, whether they're done thoughtfully with respect to individual products, or whether they're done with broad brushes. Those are, I think, the questions that, that we're looking at today, and that, frankly, I don't think we have the answer yet.
At the town hall meeting, I know at the Q&A session at the end, one of the things I got to ask Dr. Scher, I'd like you to comment on is, and in reference to what you were just talking about, when have we escalated requirements too much? And the example I used, or the analogy I used, was my kids. If I love them, they're the most precious thing in my life. And of course, you want to control, as a parent, you want to control every behavior, right? You want to put a helmet on them when they're 2 years old and they're walking down the sidewalk so they don't fall and hurt themselves. And when they're teenagers, you want to keep them from bad kids and they take away the car when they've misused the car. But you want to control their environment, and that's very much the way you are as a parent. Well, I think of my kids as having a design history file, right? And they have multiple predicates, their mother being one of them, a great predicate, by the way, and then myself being so-so. And so you combine those two to produce this kid. Now let's analogize that to a device. It's sort of FDA's baby, this 510K program, and they have a hard time, I think, letting go. And I think there's this perception, at least, that there's an incredible amount of risk averseness, almost an ideological predisposition by review staff, that A, they're not really sure they like business and they think they might be fast and loose and out to harm people to making a buck, and B, they're just simply kind of risk averse about the world. They would be that parent who probably would put a helmet on the kid and shoulder pads and everything else. What's your thought on that? Is there an imbalance today to that side, speeding innovation versus protecting the public health? By the way, I think you do protect the public health by bringing beneficial products to the market faster as well.
I hear, a lot of doom and gloom. In fact, the first meeting that I had with a venture company on the West Coast, I walked into the room, and there were these guys, and they all looked at me with these, like, their faces were just drawn, and they just, and the first word out of the first guy's mouth was, "We're just all ready to sit here and commit suicide." And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, this is my first meeting out here, I'm just starting in this business. You can't just go out and commit suicide right after this meeting." But it was sort of emblematic, I guess, of some of the things that I hear, and I think that that's a bit extreme, obviously. I think that there are going to be some changes. I think we need to recognize that there are going to be changes, again, in the 510K program. I think there will be some changes perhaps in the PMA side, although I'm not sure that those are going to be as extreme, and because I think the PMA program is pretty rigorous. I think that, over time, it has evolved, and pretty much now there isn't really that much of a difference, frankly, between a PMA and an NDA, in terms of the amount of data, the quality of the data, the rigor in terms of the review process, both from a scientific, statistical, clinical, all those different components. I think that they're pretty comparable. So yeah, I think there will be some changes, and in terms of the review staff, I think that they're always, their first inclination is always going to be to err on the side of safety, which I think is good. And it was one of the reasons, quite frankly, when people told me that they were going to approve a product, I never worried too much about it, because having been at the agency for that length of time, and started as a reviewer and as a medical officer, and then as a division director and an office director, and having sort of worked my way up and work with these people, I knew that if they were going to let something go, it was probably going to be okay. There was not too much question in my mind that, that if they said something was good enough to go to market, it was good enough to go to market. So but I do think that there are times when, when there's somewhat of a gray zone where things are not as perfect, And certainly when you're dealing with clinical trials, I think we all know, you know, the first rule of a clinical trial is you never get exactly what you expect to get. And no matter how well-intentioned and well thought out, things are always going to be a little bit different at the end than you anticipated at the beginning. And I think one of the things that that the staff needs to know is that, you know, it's okay to make some hard decisions sometimes, and it's okay to take some degree of risk as long as you can justify it and explain it, and to know that, you know, there'll be somebody higher up sort of backing that decision. And I think that's an important thing, and I hope that that will continue, because I think that's important.
Dan, I think we're all curious. How do the agency employees have that sort of speech from the center director or their branch chiefs or the division directors, sort of saying, look, here's the balance we're trying to go. You know, we appreciate that sometimes we're taking some level of risk, and we don't want you to foreclose all risk, because you're going to, do you actually spend time as a management group teaching that?
I think that, you know, as the difficult decisions get made, it sort of becomes clearer to the reviewers and the middle managers where upper management stands on certain things, you know? I mean, the easy stuff, you know, most of the time the upper management doesn't even get to see it, because it goes through and you don't get involved. But when it comes to the more difficult decisions, that's when, you know, when upper management weighs in, that's really where the messages, I think, get sent in terms of, you know, sort of what level of risk they're willing to tolerate or not tolerate. And, you know, that.
The question I think that was placed is that, you know, sounds like the Indians are running the Chiefs at FDA now, and how does management now, even present management, how you think they're going to have to deal? I noticed that Dr. Chernardy has a whistleblower that's made a claim against him. I read it a few weeks ago in the paper. And so how does management get control of the organization, and how do you respond? What is it like to be in that seat when people are complaining to Congress or the administration about decisions that you've made in good faith?
Well, let me answer that in a couple of ways. One, you know, your first question was, you know, what did you do and what did you not finish? Well, I guess what you're bringing up now is one of those areas that I do feel is unfinished business in terms of what I was able to do as Senate Director. I think that, you know, one of the things that I always enjoyed about working at CDRH, and having come from, you know, a surgical practice where, you know, we dealt with clinical issues and you know, sometimes I actually did most of my practice in the Indian Health Service, but I also had a small private practice, and I remember being, you know, in surgical lounges and listening to the conversation, and frankly it was pretty boring. I mean, it was a lot of conversation about, you know, reimbursement and, you know, the DRG, and we're not getting this and, you know, that, and, you know, and when I came to CDRH, I mean, the conversations were just really exciting, because you had all these different scientists and new technologies, and so there was a lot of good stuff. The point of all that is, you know, there were many times when there were disagreements, and there were different points of view about different products, from, you know, perhaps the statisticians seeing things one way, the engineer seeing it another way, the clinician seeing it another way, the manager seeing it another way, the regulatory person, you know, and on and on and on. And that's good. I mean, that's a good thing. And I think that leads to better decisions and more, you know, more thoughtful decisions. What's not good, and unfortunately, I think where some of this is going is when the idea is not to get to a solution, but just to continue to have discussion and argument about a certain problem, and never to sort of get to that point where you say, okay, you know, you're going to listen to me, I'm going to listen to you, and we're going to find some common ground. If that's not the end game, then getting to any kind of productive decision-making process becomes extremely difficult, and that's a really hard problem. And I think that's the problem that existed before, and sounds like it hasn't gone away.
Right.
Yeah.
It's tough. Let me ask, what changes maybe more across the board you think that need to be made in the pre-market submission process for 510Ks and PMAs? What are some, you're stepping back now, you're a bit detached, you got a chance to look at and reflect. What do you think?
In the 510K arena, there are things like transfer of ownership, quite frankly, that, it's very hard for the agency to track who owns a 510K. When you tell people that, they sort of look at you in disbelief. But the truth of the matter is the agency, as you know, does not have a way to actually track who owns a particular 510K at a particular time. I think that's a problem. I think that the issue of supply chain, especially global supply chain, is something that needs to be addressed, not just for 510K PMA, but not even just for devices, but for all medical products. I think there's really a sort of a glaring weakness there in terms of the agency's ability to account for all these products. I think that in terms of post-market, unique device identifiers, which I used to talk about a lot, the ability to track a medical device like you could track a carton of orange juice. The fact that you could do a better job with a carton of orange juice than with a heart valve, frankly, is a bit ridiculous. So we need to have a system of unique identifiers that allows us to track medical devices once they get to market. And I want to thank you, by the way, for inviting me and letting me listen. Last night I heard Dr. Nelson's talk, and I hope most of you were listening carefully, because I think what you heard there was, really the voice of experience in terms of, being on the outside and having in a lot of different spaces and really sort of understanding the medical device culture really from a lot of different points of view. And, he said some things that, to me were just right on point. One being that we need a strong FDA, just like we need a strong FAA, because we don't want planes crashing into each other, and we don't want devices failing horrendously, and we want to prevent disasters, and I think all of us want that. Two, he talked about the need for pre and post market balance, which is something I mentioned before, and the ability to be able to not only approve devices, but once they get to market, to be able to identify problems quickly, so that you can hopefully have a little bit more flexibility on the approval side, which again I thought was spot on. I think there's still some weaknesses in terms of how the agency deals with combination products. I think there have been some important improvements. I think creating the Office of Combination Products was a step forward. At least having a process, to identify who's going to take the lead on certain devices or on certain products, I should say, and working to coordinate the review processes between the two centers, whichever two centers are involved. So I think that there's been some progress, but I think there's still a long way to go. So there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, there's nobody should in any way, shape, or form think that there don't need to be changes. There do need to be changes. Again, to me it's just a matter of how they're made and how that's done.
Yeah. So. Let me get on to one other issue that I know we wanted to talk about, and that is, and I'm going to use the infusion pump guidance as an example. My concern, I think industry, we know the 510K program needs to be changed or improved. We want it to be within the framework of the existing statute. We think it's sufficiently flexible to accommodate technological innovation and allow you to ask the questions at FDA that you need to ask and the data that you need to get. But one of the concerns, I looked at the infusion guidance, and there's a lot coming at us right now as an industry. I mean, this administration has thrown, it's almost like chaos theory, throw out a bunch of stuff and see if they can keep up with you. At least that's how we feel. But the infusion guidance is kind of interesting because it kind of front-end loads requirements. It's like asking for almost like a risk evaluation or risk evaluation mitigation strategy like you'd see in a drug, a REMS strategy, like you'd see a risk mitigation plan being rolled into the 510K submission, followed by another requirement would be a pre-clearance inspection. And, you know, I know from the statute, those are requirements that you cannot ask for in a 510K review. So I have a problem as a lawyer saying that you can't be asking for that, yet they're going to be asking for it. And again, it's that risk averseness. It's so, you know, it's like I want to put that helmet on the child, and I want to have we want to make sure that everything we do, and it's well intentioned, and it actually makes some sense. But at some point, the level of regulation for a 510K has to differentiate from PMAs, or we won't get products to market, is my concern. But what's your thoughts on that?
Having lived through the era of all the recalls that went on with infusion pumps, and sort of you know, been disappointed over and over and over again, and we, you know, to be fair, I think you know, this is not new, and this is not new to this administration, and it's not new. You know, this is a problem that the agency, the center, have been dealing with for the last 5 or 10 years, and it's just continued to escalate. And I think, you know, in some ways, like the biliary stent example that you gave, it's sort of you get to a point where, you know, you try to go through the sort of the standard process, which is, as you said, you know, you separate 510K and then compliance, right? That's the way the way the statute reads, and that's what you're supposed to do. They're two separate controls, right? You're the lawyer here, right? Yeah. Okay. So I just want to make sure I get it right, you know.
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
I'll correct you if you get one off the base.
So there's two separate controls that need to be met, but they're not, you know, they're not supposed to be interconnected. So we tried that, and we did the recalls, and, you know, we did 1, we did 2, and then we did 50, you know, and we tried to continue clearing products, right, the way we're supposed to under 510K, because, you know, that was the system, that's the process. You continue to clear the products if they meet the 510K standard, and not be concerned about what's happening at the other end. Well, at some point, you have to say, this isn't working. You know, it's just not working for this group of products. And I challenged, you know, about a year ago, I actually challenged our science people and our compliance people and our pre-market people to get together and figure out a strategy to try to deal with this. And, you know, I think that strategy is now obviously coming into fruition. Again, you know, I actually have the guidance in my briefcase upstairs. I haven't read it yet, but I will. So I don't know exactly what it says, but, you know, it doesn't surprise me. And I think what, to me, it's at least it's better to focus on areas where there have been real problems, rather than, you know, rather than sort of paint the entire 510K program with a broad brush and say we're going to fix the program. I'd rather see them say, you know, there has been a problem in this area or that area or that area, and, you know, and work on a solution to fix those problems.
Let me ask you a further question, just because give us further insight as an audience, because you were privy to a lot more data about the pumps than we are. So here's my general impression. I always thought it was a lot more mechanical failures weren't really the problem, and we're probably totally wrong. But it was more user error and then a lot of off-label use. Is that incorrect?
I think it is partly incorrect.
Partly incorrect, okay.
Yeah. I think a lot of it was design issues.
Okay.
The products, they're old platforms, and again, there may be people in this room who know more about it than I do, but, you know, my understanding, they're old platforms, and, you know, people just continued to want more and more bells and whistles on these old platforms, and they kept adding more and more bells and whistles, more channels, more software, more options for the user. So I think a lot of it was, you know, it was customer driven in terms of, you know, the ICU nurse or doc or whatever saying, you know, it would be nice if you could, you know, add this feature or add that feature. So they go to the company. The company says, yeah, sure, we can put that feature on. So they end up, continually adding these features, and at some point, the number of features was beyond what the platform was designed to handle, and then, at least as I understand it, I'm not an engineer, but my understanding from the engineers and the software people is, you know, eventually all those changes together sort of overwhelmed the system. And at some point, you know, they just need to create a new platform, a new system. But that's hard to do. That takes time, and it takes money, and it takes, you know, a lot of things. And so, anyway.
Here's a question from the audience, and I'm willing to take more if people, but does the FDA have any compassion? Stop there.
No.
No. Okay. Does the FDA have any compassion to
The other FDA does.
Yeah.
I used to tell people, you know, if you don't like our decision, go to see the other FDA.
Yeah. Does the FDA have any compassion to funding requirements of device development and the cost of clinical trials?
I guess
Cut me some slack.
The answer is probably still the same. I mean, you know, the truth of the matter is the agency is not supposed to consider costs. I think that, you know, this is where you know, there was discussion earlier in the medical panel today about, you know, art versus science. You know, this is, I think, where the art of regulation starts to play a little bit, and where you sort of look at something and say, well, okay, well, we have this much data. You know, we still have a few questions that need to be addressed. You know, is it possible to address those questions in the post-market and allow the product to go to market, start generating some revenue so that we can do the additional studies that we'd like to have done? Or is it better to just say, absolutely not, we're cutting this off until we have the data pre-market, you know, it's not going to go, even knowing that in order to go back and do another randomized trial, essentially what you were doing was sort of, you know, giving that particular product and maybe even that company the death sentence. You know, is it FDA's responsibility to look at that and do that kind of analysis? Probably not. Is it something that I think should be done and should be at least factored in where there are multiple options? I mean, if there's no data, you know, and I tell people this, I said it before and I say it now, you know, there's nothing that I could do for you then or do for you now if you have crappy data or no data. I mean, you know, it is what it is. You know, that there's just, it starts with a good product and good data. If you don't have those things, then, you know, no amount of consulting or arguing or, you know, whatever is going to help you, or going to Congress is going to help you. On the other hand, if you do have a good device and good data, then it's a matter of, you know, how do you package the discussion, the explanation, and how do you try to give the agency what it needs to help you do what you want to do? And that's the space that, you know, I think a lot of us try to operate in, right?
Mm-hmm. There were occasions when you had review staff who said, nah, we don't think this product should be cleared or approved. Mm-hmm. And then you disagreed with them, or you or Donna B. Tillman, or both. Mm-hmm. What runs through your mind when you're sitting in that situation? You know, how do you go about addressing your staff? Because you know you're about to overrule them, and what's some of the thinking that you go through your mind?
I always tried, you know, and I don't know whether I succeeded, but, you know, I think if you go back and talk to people in the center, they always knew that I was going to tell them the truth. I was going to be honest with them. And in those situations, I would say, look, you know, you guys did a great job. You did your job. Your job as a reviewer is to be tough, to ask the hard questions, to do the most rigorous analysis that you can do, and to make a decision. My job is at that level, at this level, or whatever, is to look at it in a little bit broader perspective. And the fact that I'm looking at it in a broader perspective in no way detracts from the fact that you did your job right. And, you know, again, this is one of those cases where, you know, as scientists or public health officials, we have a right to disagree times, you know. I mean, it didn't happen very often. If you look at the number of times when, you know, when I overturned, you know, a decision, many times what would happen is we would have a discussion and reach some common understanding, whereas we would go back say, go back to a company and say, you know, I'm not going to overturn the decision, but, you know, maybe we can work out some sort of process by which you can go back and provide this amount of additional information that could satisfy the review process. And so a lot of it was more that than, you know, sort of yes or no, or, you know, I'm right, you're wrong, that kind of thing.
When, you know, everybody's afraid to abandon their reviewer and upset them, especially if they have future products to go through the system.
Sure. You know, I think there is a process, and I think as long as you go through the process the way it's set up, you know, going up the chain of command, and you do it in an open way, and just say, look, you know, again, as on the inside, you know, there are times when we just need to agree to disagree, and you know, you don't think the data's there, I do. I would like to, you know, take it to the next level, whether that be the branch chief or the division director or the office director. So I'm, you know, I intend to, you know, put in a 1075 appeal or whatever, and take it to the next level and get another opinion, and that's fine. I think most of the reviewers and, you know, most of the people there understand that that's part of the system. That's the way it is, and it's the way it should be. I think that where things get ugly is when, you know, when it becomes personalized, and when, you know, unfortunately, there are times when attorneys and consultants.
Dan, come on.
I know. It's hard to imagine that an attorney would write a nasty letter, but I've seen a couple. And
not from me.
Not from you. No, not from you. Never from you. You know, and sort of, you know, disparaging the intelligence, or, you know, or their, you know, the reviewer's motherhood or whatever. You know, I mean, it's just not appropriate. It's not appropriate in that kind of professional setting, and to me, it's not appropriate in pretty much any setting. And you know, then you know, that's when, and what happens, frankly, and I've told people this before, and sometimes I blame the review staff as well, because I think they sometimes just need to say, enough's enough, you know, we're just going to escalate this up to the next level and get some help. Mm-hmm. Because unfortunately what happens is, you know, when two people have been arguing the same set of issues for, you know, 6 months or a year or 2 years or 5 years, you know, I mean, you just get to a point where you don't want to look at that person anymore. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's just common, you know, sort of human interaction, that you're just tired of looking at that person, and, you know, they write the same letter in, you know, you write the same letter back, and, you know, they write the same letter reworded in again, and you write the same letter back, and pretty soon you're ticked off, you know? Everybody's just had it. And, you know, I think it would be better in those situations to say, you know, we've gone as far as we can go with this person or at this level. It's time to move it up, and do it before it starts to get ugly.
Bad feelings, yeah.
Right?
Okay. Well, I think that wraps up our time. I've been trying to get him here. The 3 years I struck out, and I thought, when you get 3 strikes, you're out, right? But I got him the 4th time, and we're so grateful to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.